A millionaire thought the woman he was going to marry was unattractive, but he was greatly surprised when she took off her photo. Daniyar grew up in an environment where happy feelings were seen only as tools, and relationships were based on calculated contracts. As an heir to one of the largest financial empires in the country, he understood from a young age that everything had its price. Nothing was done out of generosity or true love. For Daniyar, the world revolved around interests, and trusting someone was like inviting yourself to be deceived. So, when his father joyfully announced his upcoming wedding with a girl named Aidana, Daniyar agreed without hesitation. He knew nothing about Aidana, how she looked or what she thought. His father's voice, filled with strategic intentions, left no room for resistance. The family's way of life was based on cold calculations and full control. Daniyar accepted the marriage to Aidana as just another business agreement. He knew very little about her. She was the only daughter of a traditional and closed-off family that owned a construction conglomerate. She was described as simple and well-mannered, but there was one thing that caught Daniyar's attention, or rather irritated him. She always kept her face covered. Even at rare formal events, her face would be partially concealed, giving the impression that she was intentionally distancing herself from the world. Daniyar didn't bother with such questions. His main goal was to strengthen the alliance between the two influential families. The wedding day passed just like any other celebration organized by the Joy family, special, elegant, and full of wealth. The church hall was adorned with golden chandeliers and white flowers, and their sweet fragrance was almost overwhelming. For Daniyar, it was just another performance. In his perfect suit, he shook hands with influential guests, took pictures, and exchanged polite words that meant nothing to him. However, everything changed when the church doors opened and Aidana walked in. Unexpectedly, Daniyar felt something shift inside him. She wore a delicate white veil, and with each step, her photo seemed to move gently. Her figure was flawless, and the raised head exuded a silent pride, blending with the softness of her movements. Daniyar felt emotions he couldn't identify. Why did she seem so unattainable? Why did her photo feel like it was hiding something? The ceremony proceeded according to the familiar script, but Daniyar could no longer focus on the business deal that was supposed to be his marriage. Daniyar didn't listen to the religious leader's words. He just stared at Aidana. A mysterious feeling stirred inside him as it awakened emotions he had never labeled before. Finally, when the moment came for the veil to be lifted, Daniyar noticed that the whole room seemed to draw in with him. For the first time in years, his heart beat strongly, and he didn't like this feeling. The hall seemed to fall into stillness, as if time had stopped. The whispers of the guests, the flashes of the cameras, the soft murmurs, everything suddenly disappeared. When Aidana was asked to lift her veil, Daniyar, usually calm and composed, could feel his palms sweating. This irritated him. He had never been one to care about appearances, especially something as trivial as the looks of his fiancée. Yet, he couldn't suppress the feeling that broke the calmness in his chest. Aidana's delicate hands slowly moved towards the edge of her veil. This gesture appeared so graceful, almost like a theatrical scene. The entire hall fell into silence once again. Finally, when the fabric slid off and revealed her face, Daniyar was deeply stunned. He struggled to hide his reaction. Aidana's beauty was astonishing, but the issue wasn't just her appearance. What struck Daniyar was the exceptional calm and strength that seemed to emanate from her, breaking through his usual cold demeanor. Her soft, pale face, delicate features, and deep gray eyes showed a harmonious blend of fragility and strength. She appeared to have no fear, no embarrassment, yet she exuded a sense of being fully in control, as if she was observing everything around her. Daniyar's throat went dry, and he couldn't understand why she seemed so unattainable, why her presence felt like it was hiding something. There was an unknown, unexplainable feeling deep within him, a feeling he had never experienced before. Beneath her perfect composure, Daniyar sensed a subtle melancholy, a quiet wound that couldn't be ignored, though it wasn't visible at first glance. He had always been good at reading people, yet for the first time, he found himself unable to understand this woman, and he felt a crack in his usual confidence. As the room gradually returned to normal, the whispers began again, camera flashes started, and artificial smiles returned to people's faces. But Daniyar noticed none of it. His gaze remained fixed on Aidana, and when she met his eyes, he suddenly felt exposed, like he had no defenses, no weapons. She didn't smile, but there was something in her eyes, either a silent invitation or perhaps a hidden disregard. Daniyar couldn't tell. The ceremony continued, but he felt as if he were isolated from everything and everyone. The words of the vow seemed to weaken. The distant hum of the crowd felt like it was coming from another world. Even when he uttered the official words that would make Aidana his wife, his mind was elsewhere. As they walked out together after the ceremony, Daniyar felt a huge gap between them, despite walking side by side. They seemed close, yet so far apart. He was uneasy. It was an unfamiliar feeling, one that urged him to unravel the mystery of this woman. Who was she? Why was she so calm? How had she so peacefully accepted this arrangement? What was hiding behind her gaze? A gaze that seemed to hold countless stories. When they arrived at the family's new home, they sat together in the back of the limousine, but it felt like thousands of kilometers separated them. Daniyar sneaked glances, trying to find something he couldn't understand. Aidana sat still, her perfect form and frozen demeanor. Her eyes were fixed on the city lights outside, as if they were more interesting than the man who had just become her husband. Daniyar had always prided himself on his ability to control situations, but this time, his anger began to bubble. Why was she so composed? What reaction was she waiting for? A little nervousness, a little embarrassment, or at least a sign that she was trying to connect. But Aidana was completely indifferent. She wasn't trying to dislike him, but she didn't actively engage either. To her, Daniyar seemed like just another part of the decor, an accessory. Daniyar clenched his fists, his anger rising. Who was she to show such behavior? When they reached the family home, the building's architecture and lighting made everything look even more majestic. Daniyar got out of the car and extended his hand to Aidana, almost like a formality. She briefly took his hand, accepting it with a cold, reserved grip. This unfamiliar feeling stirred something inside Daniyar. It wasn't just a rejection of physical closeness. There was a resistance in her he had never seen before. They had dinner together in one of the family's grand banquet halls, but the tension in the air was palpable. Daniyar tried to start a conversation, but Aidana answered only with brief, calm responses, her composed demeanor slowly frustrating him. There was no sign in her words or actions of who she truly was. After dinner, Aidana stood up and, to his surprise, thanked him for the meal. "Thank you for dinner," she said, her voice calm and steady. Daniyar could only look at her, still unsure of what to make of her. Daniyar looked at her with a smile, but there was a trace of mystery in his expression. Aidana's voice, however, was cold as she responded, though a cryptic smile lingered on her lips. Daniyar stood motionless, watching her walk out of the hall, intrigued by the way she seemed to be in full control of everything. He, on the other hand, hadn't expected this. That night, Daniyar couldn't sleep. He lay on the large bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand the emotions swirling inside him. It was a mix of curiosity, anger, and a feeling he couldn't quite name, a sense of something being off. He had always been sure that this marriage was entirely in his control, but now, he was beginning to doubt that certainty. Aidana was supposed to be just another piece on his chessboard, but in this moment, he realized that he had lost track of the game entirely. Worse, he had no idea of the rules anymore. Meanwhile, Aidana sat alone in another room, combing her hair in front of a small mirror. Her eyes, reflecting something different from her usual calm demeanor, showed fatigue and a subtle sadness. She absent-mindedly traced the simple pendant around her neck with her fingers, the elegant jewels she wore at the wedding feeling out of place against the simplicity of the necklace. The game had begun. Daniyar murmured to himself that the night felt warm, almost joyful as he turned off the lights. The next morning, Daniyar descended the stairs, expecting to find Aidana enjoying breakfast. But to his surprise, she wasn't there. The house, which usually felt grand and comforting, now seemed cold and empty. The sunlight streaming through the tall windows felt like an eternal, almost distant presence. Sitting alone, he listened to the faint sound of milk being poured into thin porcelain cups, the only noise breaking the silence. It was as if the house was echoing his solitude. As he sipped his coffee, a servant entered, holding an envelope. "Your wife asked me to give this to you," she said coolly, without any emotion, her tone as formal as ever. Daniyar raised an eyebrow, surprised as he took the envelope. He opened it carefully and pulled out a single sheet of paper. The writing was neat, delicate, almost a perfect reflection of Aidana's nature. I will be in the garden. Don't worry, I can find my way back home, the note read. Daniyar frowned, puzzled. Find my way back home? What was this? A warning? A mockery? Or perhaps an invitation hidden behind a veil? He quickly stood up, feeling a mix of anger and unease, and headed toward the garden. What was waiting for him there? He had no idea. Aidana remained an unsolved mystery to him, and this only aggravated him more. Daniyar had always prided himself on understanding people, predicting their every move. But now, he felt like just another piece on the chessboard, only he wasn't sure which way to move. When he reached the garden, he saw her. Aidana sat on a stone bench, holding an object that looked like an old book. Its pages appeared worn, as though it had been opened hundreds of times before. The wind played with her flawless hair, causing a few strands to escape their careful arrangement. She was so absorbed in thought that she didn't immediately notice Daniyar's arrival. When she finally looked up, her eyes reflected something new, a warmth, a depth far from her usual coldness. There was something more human, more delicate in them now. But before Daniyar could fully comprehend what he was seeing, Aidana slowly closed the book and erected the invisible wall she so skillfully built around herself. I always thought you were a very busy businessman, Daniyar remarked, his mysterious smile not fading. And I thought you were someone who preferred staying at home, Aidana replied, attempting to maintain her control over the conversation. Daniyar smirked, trying to steer the conversation back under his control. But Aidana simply chuckled softly, not paying attention to his guarded tone. Sometimes, the silence of the garden speaks more than any conversation, she said, gazing down at her book, her fingers gently caressing its worn cover. What are you reading? Daniyar asked, his curiosity piqued. Daniyar asked the question himself, an unexpected one. He didn't quite understand why he wanted to continue the conversation, but something about it pulled him in. The story of sacrifices. Maybe you don't understand it as well as you think, Daniyar Quanishuli, Aidana said, her eyes locking with his. In that moment, Daniyar felt as though he had been exposed, stripped of everything. Aidana had seen something in him that he didn't even know existed. Before he could respond, she pressed the book to her chest, stood up slowly, and made her way toward the house. Daniyar silently watched as she entered through the main door. At that instant, a thought struck him. Aidana wasn't just a figure in his mind, she was the game itself. And Daniyar had no idea how to play it. That night, Daniyar once again couldn't sleep. He had grown used to sleepless nights, but this time, it wasn't due to work contracts or upcoming meetings. The reason was Aidana. Every time he closed his eyes, her gaze lingered in his memory. Her mysterious voice spoke of something he knew, but still couldn't fully grasp. Her words about sacrifices echoed in his mind, ringing like an unsolvable riddle. The next morning, when Daniyar came down for breakfast, he noticed the table had been set, but Aidana was nowhere to be found. He looked around, feeling a faint sense of unease, and called for the housekeeper. "Where is my wife?" he asked, a question he never asked before, always expecting everything to be in its rightful place. But something had changed within him. He needed to know. He had to know. "She's in the library, sir," the servant replied, with the detached formality typical of the household. Daniyar paused for a moment, thinking. Then, without another word, he headed for the library. Normally, he avoided unnecessary meetings, but something seemed to pull him in this time. The library was the most striking room in the house, filled with shelves that reached all the way to the ceiling, stacked with books. Daniyar had never really touched them before. As he entered, he saw Aidana sitting in a chair by the window, deeply engrossed in a different book, one that was far from the one she had been holding before. Aidana didn't immediately look up, but Daniyar knew she had noticed him. It was as if she knew everything. "You found your favorite spot in the house," Daniyar said, leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed over his chest. "Books make for good companions," Aidana replied calmly, turning the page. "Unlike some people." Daniyar smiled tightly, his anger bubbling beneath the surface. It sounded absurd, coming from the person who had agreed to marry a stranger. Finally, Aidana closed the book, placing it on her lap, and looked directly at him. Her eyes were heavier now, and the unspoken burden in them left Daniyar with a sense of doubt. "How do you know what I've rejected or what I've agreed to?" Daniyar asked, his tone cheerful, but with a hidden edge. Aidana's voice, though softer, was firm. "Some things are clearer than they appear." The silence that followed was louder than any shout. Daniyar was momentarily lost for words, a feeling he hadn't experienced since childhood, when he stood before his father's stern gaze. But, quickly, he regained his composure. He never allowed anyone, especially his wife, to put him in an uncomfortable situation. "Then tell me, Aidana, why did you agree? What game are you playing?" Daniyar asked, his voice steady but probing. Aidana tilted her head slightly, as though considering the question, or perhaps studying it. After a few seconds, she smiled faintly and answered, "Everyone has their secrets, Daniyar. Some secrets are so heavy that they can't be shared." Before Daniyar could respond, Aidana picked up the book with deliberate care, stood up, and placed it back on the shelf. Daniyar watched every movement of hers, unable to identify whether he was feeling anger, curiosity, or something else entirely. As Aidana left the library, Daniyar continued to stare at the spot where she had been. In that moment, he understood something. He had encountered something he could not control. Aidana was an unsolvable riddle, and he knew he wouldn't find peace until he solved it. That night, Daniyar sat alone, listening to the sound of rain tapping against the window. He was in his study, surrounded by papers, but his mind was far from them. His thoughts were scattered, and all that echoed in his mind was Aidana's name. It felt as though everything had changed since the wedding. The person who had always viewed the world with calm detachment was now consumed with worry. Something had shaken the foundation of his life this year. His thoughts were interrupted by the faint sound of footsteps in the corridor. It immediately caught his attention. Rising from his seat, unable to resist, Daniyar followed the sound. At the end of the corridor, he noticed the door to the music room slightly ajar. Soft light from a small table lamp illuminated the room, and through the door, he saw Aidana sitting at the piano. He had never known she could play music. Her hands moved confidently over the keys, but what surprised him the most was the emotion that emanated from the melody. It wasn't a perfect tune. There was darkness in it, something unavoidable that filled the room. Daniyar stood silently, listening, caught off guard by the feelings the music stirred in him. When the final note played, Aidana stopped, but didn't look back. "Are you just going to stand there, Daniyar?" she asked, her voice pulling him back to reality. "Or are you going to come inside?" Her words reminded him that he had been noticed. He entered the room, crossing his arms over his chest, trying to appear in control, but he realized in that moment that this was not the case. "I didn't know you could play," Daniyar said, his voice betraying a hint of surprise. "You don't know many things about me," Aidana replied without looking at him, closing the lid of the piano. She rose from her seat, as calm and composed as ever, but when she took a step, she suddenly swayed. Daniyar immediately reacted, catching her before she fell. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice tinged with concern, a rare emotion for him to show. Aidana looked up at him, and in that moment, Daniyar noticed something he hadn't seen before, a brief flash of pain in her eyes. She quickly tried to pull away, but he wouldn't let her go. "There's no need to handle me like I'm some fragile object," Aidana said, her tone steady, though there was a hint of something beneath it. "I wasn't," Daniyar began to explain, but her words cut him off. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice softer now. Only then did Daniyar realize that he wouldn't let her go. Seeing her in such a vulnerable state made him feel something he had never felt before, something that disarmed him completely. Aidana sighed heavily, as though carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. For a moment, it seemed like she was about to say something, but then she looked away, her gaze distant. "You don't understand," Aidana murmured softly. Daniyar stood there, watching her, trying to make sense of it all. His gaze fell on her hands, and that's when he noticed something. A faint but noticeable scar on her skin, a trace of a past battle, not a wound from a simple injury. They were the marks of someone who had fought for their life. "Who did this to you?" Daniyar asked, his voice surprisingly gentle. Aidana looked at him, and for a moment, there was something unreadable in her eyes. "Some battles don't need to be shared," she said quietly. "Just respect that I've been through them." He left the room, leaving Daniyar alone in the quiet stillness. Daniyar stood silently, listening to the sound of the rain tapping against the window as his thoughts fully consumed him. In that moment, he realized that Aidana was not just a mystery. She was a woman who had lived through life's harsh trials and struggles, her unknown battles leaving their mark. This revelation shook Daniyar deeply. He felt weaker than ever before. In the following days, Daniyar felt a strange heaviness in his heart. He couldn't stop thinking about Aidana and her words, as though the news from the previous night had completely shifted his life. Daniyar had always been able to focus on his work, keeping his mind clear, but now, his thoughts were scattered and distracted. The scars on Aidana's hands not only astonished him, but seemed to stir deep, hidden emotions inside him. What were these marks? Where had they come from? More importantly, who was she, and who had married her? For the first time in his life, Daniyar felt helpless. Aidana's presence in the house felt almost like a ghost. She moved as calmly and composed as always, but Daniyar knew that behind this outward appearance, there was pain and mystery. He watched from afar, trying to understand her, but each of her actions was filled with enigma. Even her simple gestures seemed to alter the balance of power, leaving Daniyar feeling less in control and more full of questions. This unsettled him, yet, at the same time, intrigued him. One day, in the middle of the day, Daniyar, determined to find answers to the questions that plagued him, entered the room where Aidana was sitting. She was reading a book, and when she looked up, it seemed as though she had known he was coming. The tension between them was palpable, thick enough to feel in the air. "We need to talk," Daniyar said, crossing his arms over his chest, trying to maintain his usual confident posture, but his voice lacked its usual coolness. Aidana carefully closed the book and placed it on her lap, then glanced up at him, her expression calm yet challenging. "What do you want to talk about, Daniyar? We're married now. Or do you still see this as some kind of contract?" Her words hit Daniyar hard, but he took a deep breath and composed himself. He wasn't here to argue, he wanted to understand. "The scars on your hands," he said directly. "They aren't the marks of someone who grew up in safety and comfort. They're signs of something much harder. I want to know what happened." Aidana was silent for a few seconds, as though wrestling with her thoughts. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, but there was a deeper emotion in her eyes that Daniyar had never seen before. "Why does it concern you, Daniyar?" she asked, her eyes meeting his. "You agreed to this marriage without asking who I was. You never cared to know anything about me. And now, suddenly, you're interested in my past." She tilted her head slightly, as though daring him to justify his curiosity. Daniyar felt an uncomfortable heat rise to his face. "I need to understand who I'm facing," he said, trying to explain himself. Aidana let out a small laugh, but there was no trace of joy in it. "Understand," she repeated, her voice filled with quiet sarcasm. "You want to control everything, Daniyar. You manage your business the same way you try to control people. But people aren't contracts, and my past isn't something that can be bought or sold." Her words struck Daniyar deeply, and he fell silent. But before he could say anything, Aidana stood up. "You don't understand me, Daniyar. You don't even need to try," she said, picking up her book and leaving the room. Daniyar stood frozen in the center of the room, alone once more. He looked out the window, hearing the sound of raindrops against the glass. His mind was full of thoughts, and he felt consumed by the mystery of Aidana. He knew that he wouldn't find peace until he figured her out. Aidana's eyes met his earlier, and he remembered her words. "Some scars remind us where we came from, and some protect us from places we never want to return to." Daniyar stood still, hearing her words echo in his mind as she walked out of the room, leaving him in solitude. For the first time in his life, Daniyar realized that there were things he couldn't solve with power, money, or influence. Aidana was not just a matter of understanding. She was something far deeper than he had imagined. He was a man full of complex contradictions. If he truly wanted to understand Aidana, he needed to rise above his pride and learn to look deeper. That night, Daniyar made a decision. Aidana's secrets couldn't remain hidden. This wasn't about control. This was the first time he truly wanted to know the truth. Daniyar was always known for his persistence. When he made a decision, he never backed down. He was the kind of person who always maintained control and solved mysteries. But Aidana felt like a new obstacle, as if he had slammed into a wall he couldn't break through. This feeling both frustrated and fascinated him. He wanted to know what was hidden behind the woman's perfect exterior. It wasn't just curiosity. The uncertainty around Aidana seemed to pull him into an unknown abyss. That morning, Daniyar made a decision that would change everything. If Aidana wasn't going to give him the answers, he would find them himself. He knew exactly where to start: the family business. Aidana's family was known for their wealth and influence in the construction industry. But Daniyar felt there was something much deeper hidden beneath their history. The combination of pain and determination in Aidana's eyes hinted that this family was not just built on wealth and power. He entered his office and began his search. His trusted assistant and private detective, Boris Ivanov, had helped him with many complicated matters in the past. Daniyar called him immediately, eager to dive into the investigation. "Find out everything about the Orlik family," he ordered, his voice firm and confident, though there was a growing unease within him. Part of him even doubted whether he truly wanted to uncover what lay hidden behind it all. As he worked on the research, Daniyar tried to return to his usual tasks, but he couldn't focus. That evening, he saw Aidana walking through the garden again. He stopped, drawn to her once more. She turned to look back at him, her eyes focused on the branches of the tree, swaying in the wind. For a moment, Daniyar stood still, then walked over to her, trying to calm the excitement rising within him. "It's rare to see you like this, just standing there," he said, breaking the silence. Aidana turned slowly, a mysterious smile playing at the corners of her lips. "Sometimes you have to let the wind take things away," she said calmly, her voice steady. Daniyar frowned, unsure whether this was some lesson or another riddle she was presenting. "Is this a lesson or another mystery?" he asked. Aidana simply smiled, her eyes serious. "Perhaps both," she replied. "Haven't you learned yet, Daniyar? You can't control everything." Her words struck Daniyar deeper than he expected, and before he could respond, his phone began to buzz in his pocket. It was Boris. Daniyar excused himself, taking a few steps back to answer the call. "There's information, but you won't like it," Boris said, his tone heavy with unusual seriousness. Daniyar gripped the phone tightly, preparing himself for whatever was to come. "The Orlik family nearly went bankrupt years ago," Boris continued. "They faced severe financial crises, but managed to hide everything. But there's something even more important. This is personal," Boris finished, his voice gravely serious. Daniyar's mind raced, knowing this revelation was far deeper than he had anticipated. He had only just begun to understand how complicated this mystery truly was. Aidana had not lived the life Daniyar had imagined. In the documents, there was a tragic story written. Her younger sister, Maria, had died under suspicious circumstances. All of this had been hidden, but Boris remained silent for a moment. There was an inconsistency in the story. A cold shiver ran down Daniyar's spine. Her sister. She had never spoken about her. He ended the call in silence and returned to Aidana, who was still in the garden, lost in thought. Daniyar approached her, wanting to ask, to demand an answer, but something stopped him. For the first time, he was afraid to cross the line, to return to a place where there was no going back. He stepped away, the anxiety within him lingering. There were more secrets within Aidana's past than he had ever imagined. Daniyar understood that his attempt to uncover these secrets wasn't just about finding out about Aidana, but also about confronting his own true self. He wasn't ready for that yet. The grand house of the Ivanovs was shrouded in night. The rain fell relentlessly, streaming down the windows as if the sky itself was showing its sorrow. Daniyar walked confidently, but inside, a storm raged. The fragments of information he had gathered echoed in his mind, replaying over and over. Every new detail seemed to drive him further into a dead end. The tragic incident, the missing sister, the hidden scandals. Daniyar couldn't figure out what he was feeling. Was he angry at Aidana for hiding everything, or did he sympathize with the burden she carried alone? But he knew that tonight, avoiding the conversation was no longer an option. The time had come. The only question was how to begin. How would he approach Aidana? How would he speak to her without breaking her down? Daniyar was used to making decisions quickly and with clarity, but with Aidana, everything seemed more delicate, more human. He didn't want to burden her any further. For the first time in his life, he genuinely wanted to understand someone. Daniyar found Aidana in the music room, sitting behind the piano. The soft glow of the lamps cast shadows on her face, making her seem vulnerable and wistful. He watched her for a moment before finally asking, "Who is Maria?" Aidana stopped playing. The question hung in the air, like a false note, disrupting the harmony. She didn't answer immediately. It seemed as though she was carefully weighing her words, knowing that anything she said could shatter the world she had built. "Where did you hear that name?" she whispered, her voice full of emotion. "It doesn't matter," Daniyar replied softly, though his determination remained strong. "What matters is you never spoke of her." He took a step closer, his voice calm but resolute. "I can't keep pretending I don't know anything. Who is Maria? What happened?" Aidana took a deep breath, her shoulders stiffening, but she still didn't turn to face him. "Maria is my sister," she said, her voice trembling, but she continued. "She was the bright one, the exceptional one, everything I couldn't be." Her words were soft, but they carried a weight that Daniyar couldn't ignore. "Our father was a harsh man. He controlled everything. Our lives were a game of power and manipulation. Every decision, every laugh, every step we took." Daniyar felt a cold chill down his spine as he heard these words. It was as if Aidana's words were dredging up memories from his own childhood. "Maria wanted to run away," Aidana continued, her voice breaking slightly. "She wanted freedom. And then, for the first time, Aidana turned to him. Her eyes were cold and empty. "I couldn't protect her," she said quietly. Daniyar silently allowed her to continue speaking. "She loved someone our father didn't approve of." Aidana's voice trembled. "When our father found out, he turned it into a weapon against her. He took Maria away from the person she loved and shattered her life." Finally, Aidana stifled a sob, struggling to keep her voice steady. She took her own life," she confessed, her words striking like lightning. Daniyar felt the weight of her pain, as if it were his own. His chest tightened, and he felt like he couldn't breathe. He stepped closer, but Aidana raised her hand to stop him. "There's no need to say anything, Daniyar. I don't expect you to understand me," she said quietly. "I don't expect anything from you." Tears rolled down Aidana's face, but her voice remained steady. "The only thing I've learned is that love is weakness," she whispered. "It's a trap. I married you because that's what was expected of me. Nothing more." Her words cut into him like a knife, but Daniyar didn't retreat. He understood this was the pivotal moment, the chance to prove something, if not to her, then to himself. He didn't know if he believed in love, but in that instant, one thing was clear. He wanted to be by Aidana's side. "You're not alone anymore, Aidana," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "Never again." He took another step, and this time, Aidana didn't stop him. Daniyar gently reached out, brushing his hand against hers. Aidana looked at him, surprised to see the sincerity in his eyes. For the first time, she saw something unexpected in Daniyar, humanity. "I can't change what happened to Maria," she said, her voice soft and filled with pain. "But I can be here for you. For you." Daniyar hesitated, searching for the right words. "I might not know how to do this right, but I'll try," he said, his voice sincere. Aidana closed her eyes, allowing the tears to fall freely. Daniyar didn't wipe them away. He simply held her hand, saying nothing. This gesture spoke volumes. It was a promise that he would never leave her. The room was silent, except for the sound of rain tapping against the window. The soft sound filled the space between them, replacing the need for words. For the first time, the wall between them began to fall. It wasn't sudden. Rather, it felt like the quiet, gentle understanding of two wounded souls coming together, finding comfort in each other's presence. Did you enjoy the story? Your opinion is very important to us, so please leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, don't miss the chance to become part of this amazing community. Also, don't forget to check out other content we've carefully prepared for you with special love. See you in the next video.